It had been rumored for years that one of the pilots on one of the flights out of Roswell had actually seen the bodies. But the rumor did not become a reality until 1982, when Pappy Henderson finally spoke out. He told his wife, "I've been dying to tell you for years."
We were in the grocery store in San Diego, where we had lived for many years, and we were at the checkout stand, and here was a paper, the Globe, I believe it was. Here was all of the story about it. In fact, I still have the papers here. And he said, he took a look, and he said, "I've been wanting to tell you about this for years. I guess if they're putting in the papers now, it's no longer a top secret." And he said, he bought the papers, and we went to the car, and he said, "Read those." And I read the article, and he said, "It's a true story." He said, "Not only did I know about it, but I'm the pilot that took the crashed saucer to Dayton, Ohio." I was astonished, and if it hadn't been Pappy telling me, I probably wouldn't have believed it. But he was very confident, and he was always very truthful and straightforward. So I believed him. But in those days, if you said you'd seen a spacecraft or a flying saucer, you were put in the annals of a nut. So we didn't say much about this. But years before, when people would ask him what he thought about flying saucers, his answer was, "There's something to it."
William McDonald worked with Tester's company to design an authentic model based on the recovered Roswell craft.
In 1993, I was hired as the concept designer to the movie Roswell, and after completing that assignment, I decided to find out what the real spacecraft and the real bodies looked like, having nothing to do with the film. My research took me into a 4-year journey of interviewing military officers and other researchers who supplied with me the data that I needed to do full forensic composites of what the flight crew and the spacecraft looked like that crashed at Roswell on July 4th, 1947 at 11 o'clock in the evening. Much to my surprise, it was not a disc. It was a winged vehicle, a wave rider, one of those lifting body, transatmospheric, high-speed recon type of vehicles. It was amazing what we came up with. It was extremely unique. We found out many years later that everybody, including Ben Rich, knew that this vehicle had been the design Rosetta Stone, the holy grail of aerospace designs. We found that inside this vehicle had microprocessors that looked like the neuroganglia tissue that you see in a human brain. The entire vehicle was found to have biomorphic characteristics, those being called biomimetic or biomimicry. This vehicle, when by itself, exhibited artificial intelligence, but when you plugged all 7 flight crew members into all 7 flight crew stations, you had an interface between their physical bodies and the neurological structure of the spacecraft, which was exotic metal and non-organic components, mostly crystalline metals in exotic mixtures. That way, the vehicle became, in essence, akin to a living being with multiple brain nodes.
So it's a very interesting situation right now. And I still think about that Roswell case, how things would be so different. I want to see that craft. I want to see it in the museum. I want to see the bodies. Mm-hmm. And I'm not stopping until I do, because I think that we can take it. If ETs are hostile, and I don't think there's any evidence of that, they could have taken over years ago. And when people are taken on board, yeah, it's scary, and sometimes it's painful and involuntary, it appears to be, but there's no evidence of sadism. There's no evidence of we want to hurt you and they're having fun with it. Sure. No mass murderers, nothing like what we do.
It would have happened already if that were the case. Yeah, they were.
Right. So they try to relieve people's pain. They try to understand emotions. They're different from us for sure, but I think not that different. More alike us than different.
Wow. So where do you start? I mean, you brought up the list of 3 things in particular. So there's Roswell, number 1, and then the military component, and then there's also the powers that be, that 1%. It's starting with Roswell, wow. There again, that's one of those things where the evidence is, overwhelming there again with to support that. Number one, that they released that this happened. Then they, like you said, they backpedaled. The craft within itself, man, it goes on and on, because I know that was Corona, and supposedly it was two particular, I think, crash sites, and that's kind of true. Yeah, but with Roswell, like, that's one of the things I had on the list to ask you too, like your opinion on, I guess, where do you start with? There again, you had connecting the dots. I think one of the outstanding witnesses that I had horned in on it. I mean, there's so many, but I think for those who don't know Frankie Rowe, I think her dad was, what was said, the story goes, he was probably one of the first people called out to the sites. I think he worked for the fire department. Dan Dwyer, I believe what his name was. And then he was one of the first people or witnesses that said he actually saw, witnessed the bodies, like 3, I think, that were maybe deceased to an extent, and one walking around. But nevertheless, the story goes, she, for those who had claims to that, her in particular, when I recall seeing interviews with her, and there was a disturbing look that she had, that when particular military people confronted their family, they were threatened to the point where tears were coming to her eyes, because it was so disturbing. Like, when you think of the military, it's like, oh, they're here to protect us, but why are they so, adamant about that this is something that we didn't experience? And it was that truth-telling component of when you see her whole demeanor change to where she's literally disturbed by what she encountered with the military figures, whoever they may have been. I remember her saying, like, he would pound his hand, saying something like, we have the authority to, even do some things that was indirectly applied. Like, if you're not going to kind of go along with this story, there might be some physical, things that could happen to your family and all that you may not be, something that you don't want to happen. So you didn't see anything, and this is the story that you want to, follow through with. So can you like elaborate on that? There again, that I was only bringing her up because there again, you have someone, in my opinion, not just her, but there have been other witnesses that have kind of made those claims who had some abrasive encounters with military officials that wasn't apparently pleasant. Right. Yeah, and that goes back to kind of like the kids, or there again, when you look at all of these other independent kind of experiences, that's the one dominating thing when you have military showing up and they're doing anything but support what's happening. They either confiscate particular things if there's some type of site evidence is covered up, or they're verbally indicating to witnesses like, hey, this is not a good idea. This is not something you want to, basically like promote, just kind of be quiet and go along with what we're telling you to say. You didn't have this experience, and that's in the story.
Or else.
Right.
Seriously, I mean, this was a huge deal. The Roswell incident is the grandfather of all UFO cases. I mean, this is it. And I don't think it's going to go away. The Roswell case is unique in that it's one of the UFO crash retrieval stories that we do have over 100 witnesses for. Most of these crash retrieval cases, and there's a lot of them. It's not just Roswell. There are hundreds. I've written UFOs over California, UFOs over New Mexico, New York, Arizona, Colorado. They all have UFO crash retrieval accounts. Yeah. Multiple. So I'm like, whoa. I knew about Roswell, but I didn't. And I knew that there were others. Certainly, there's famous one in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, Aztec UFO crash, New Mexico, the Aurora crash in Arizona. But no, there's hundreds. And Roswell's the best one because what I love about the Roswell case is they tracked this case, researchers, and there's a lot of them. There's about 100 books on Roswell, by the way. Literally, not kidding. They've tracked this case from the first witnesses who saw this coming out of the sky. A group of nuns and a guy driving through with his kid, and scattered witnesses saw this object coming down. There was people at Air Force bases, and they tracked it on radar. So they've got those witnesses. They've got, Mac Brazel, who saw it, came upon the wreckage of it, not the actual craft itself, but the outer skin, apparently, because there was a couple of crash sites. This thing touched down in another rancher's field and left this giant burn mark. They've got evidence of that. It's a complicated case, much more complicated than even I think people within the UFO community realize. There was a lot of witnesses. So they've interviewed the people who guarded the wreckage, who were the first ones to come upon it, the people who transported the bodies, people who transported the wreckage, the people who did autopsy the bodies. I mean, they've literally interviewed everybody who was involved with this. And enormously compelling testimony from people like Glenn Dennis, the mortuary guy who's was asked, do you have child-sized coffins? And he brought him in and he saw the bodies. Or he also talked to a nurse who was there, and she disappears, apparently killed. There's Walter Haut, who did the press release, who said, he later said he saw the bodies, years later after the incident, who was still afraid to talk about it, but said, he saw the bodies as well. A lot of witnesses, and Frankie Rowe, hearing her testimony, hearing her weep as she's describing how her dad came home and said, oh my God, this happened. And he's describing the wreckage and the bodies, and he had a piece of the metal. And he laid it out, and he's like, watch, and you can crumple it up, and it comes folding back out with no creases or anything. And she held it and touched it, and she's like, wow, really cool. She's like, I think she was 12 or so. And then shows up these Army guys, and they're not mincing words. No, they said flat out, you will not talk about this. It never happened. If you talk about it, you will end up as dog food, and we will bury you in the desert. Don't talk about it, or you're dead. And they did not, equivocate at all. They flat out threatened them. And numerous witnesses were threatened in that manner, or actually killed. I think there's probably more to that than we publicly know. But what the military did, starting then, is against the law. There's such a thing as national security, but you're not allowed to threaten witnesses. And you're not allowed to kill them.
Sure.
And there's been a lot of very suspicious deaths surrounding this field.
Indeed.
Moving forward from that, it's not just Roswell.
That is beyond coincidence. If people were to, there again, the preponderance of evidence is unbelievable. When they're significant people with particular stories, and when you look at the list of accidental deaths or suicides, whatever it's unreal. It's staggering. The number's staggering, and you can trace them back to particular cases where they're significant enough that you're like, wow, there's something there that's just unsettling to a degree when you look at the deaths surrounding some of these cases. Where you can certainly say this is not just happenstance.
You're absolutely right, and it's alarming to say the least. There is a long list of cases of, people who say have worked with a crash retrieval case in some capacity, go public thinking, it's all right. I heard it on TV. And no, it's not all right. And they get threatened, and then they get angry, and they spill the beans, and then they're killed. Like Robert Sarbacher, a scientist from Canada, who was corresponding with William Steinman, a U.S. researcher. And Steinman's like, is it true that you handled, Roswell wreckage? And the guy's like, well, yeah, I did. It was a big project. I know about it. There was really lightweight metal. I wasn't super involved in it. But, well, Robert Sarbacher died not long after that in a, quote, boating accident. Some UFO, there's been some early deaths of UFO researchers you got to wonder about as well.
Indeed.
I once did receive a threatening phone call from a military official. Yeah, couldn't believe it. I'm a very young researcher at this time. There's a wave of sightings going on over Topanga Canyon. This is 1992 to 1994, and I am going full force. I've given the police my phone number, and they're referring me cases. I've put flyers up throughout the canyon. I am sleeping out in the fields, waiting for these craft to show up. I am going door to door, knocking on people's door. Did you see anything? So I am going all out on this. I've contacted the newspapers. Because there's this wave of sightings. They're chasing cars down the road. They're landing in the fields. They're coming in and out of the water off the coast. And that's during this time is when I received this phone call from this guy. And I was having all kinds of phone problems. I'd be interviewing someone, and all these clicks would come on and static. And the witnesses is like, "What is that?" And I'm like, I don't know. Just tell me your story. Because, it's hard to get, a hold of a witness, and you just want to talk to them when you can.
Right.
And this guy calls me, and he's like, "Are you Preston Dennett, who's researching UFOs?" And I'm like, "Yeah." Excited to hear another witness, perhaps. I'm like, "Who are you?" He's like, "Oh, I don't remember what he said his name was, but he said he's from the Army. He works in the Army on confidential projects. He worked in Vietnam doing satellite mapping. He's got top secret clearance." And he's going on and on and on about this great resume he has. I'm like, "All right, this sounds like a high-level guy." And he says, "So, UFOs, huh?" And I'm like, "Yeah." He says, "Well, what you're doing is dangerous." And I'm like, "Whoa, all right. What do you mean?" And he says, "It's dangerous. What you're doing, you could get hurt." I'm like, "All right, this guy's threatening me. This is coming across as a threat." I'm like, "Well, what do you mean?" Because I'm ready to take this to the grave. I don't care. Go ahead, kill me. You're not going to get away with this because someone else will take my place. And I'm not afraid of death. There's life after death. Life on Earth is short anyway. Right. I am going to research this. And he says, "What you're doing is dangerous." And I'm like, "All right, well, how?" And he says, "You're barking up the wrong tree." And I'm like, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "It's not what you think it is." And I'm like, I can't get a straight answer out of this guy. And he says, "Well, there's no pay dirt in it anyway." And I'm like, "Well, hold on a second. If there's no pay dirt, then why is it dangerous? That's contradictory." Right. So, he was going through all the techniques of persuasion, trying to get me off this subject. And finally, I just had enough. Like, "Listen, do you have anything to say?" And he's just going on, and we ended the conversation. But I felt like, hey, a little bit flattered that maybe I had touched a nerve.
Indeed, probably so.
And I would lecture on this case, and every now and then some guy would be in the audience, one of the audience members, and he's dressed up in a suit, and he's got his perfect coiffed hair and mirrored sunglasses and very FBI looking. You know what I mean? You just kind of get a vibe.
Right.
Because they come up to my table sometimes and they'd be like, "So, what you got cooking?" And I'm like, "Who are you?" and this guy stands up and he starts berating me. "Oh, well, that's weather phenomena. There's no way what you're talking is real. It's weather phenomena." And I'm like, "Sit down. That's not weather phenomena. This chased a car. This car was pulled off the road by a beam of light by this object that was following him. There was 2 witnesses in the car. There was 4 other witnesses that night." And I just shut him down, and the whole audience laughed. I'm like, "There you go. Take that, you bastard."
Right.
Because, fine, be skeptical, but don't debunk.
That's right.
Don't try to attack me as a person when you pull, that's ridiculous.
Sure.
And I won't have it. And we don't see a whole lot of that now of professional debunkers like Phil Klass and,
oh my gosh.
There's a couple, Donald Menzel, who was part of MJ12.
Indeed.
I
have to say,
all riled up.
Yeah, right. Philip Klassman, I swear, you come across skeptics, and when you can justify certain things, you understand it. But when it gets to the absurd point where they just pull anything out of the air, man, it's really it's so disappointing, and no merit behind what they're throwing out there. And that was, I think, out of all of the skeptics or debunkers, he at the top of my personal list of being one of the ultimate guys I just surely did not like amongst some of the others, but he was like number one. I was just like, wow, really, guy? And so many other questions come up as to like, what are you trying to do? Is to trying to shut down, like, what's your purpose of constantly? I mean, there's nothing that he would support at all, and many of them don't. It's just it makes no sense. But I'm just really. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think they knew UFOs were real.
Oh, sure.
And it was their. I don't know if they were being paid or not. I know that Donald Menzel, he was being paid.
Indeed.
And he wrote books on UFOs and said they weren't real when he knew they were.
Sure, certainly.
To be that disingenuous is unforgivable. Indeed.
I'm going to bring up one thing and then reel it back real quick, Preston, with, I guess just to close out on Roswell. So the explanation, the official explanation, which was absurd, of course, was the whole weather balloon piece. And so two things in particular, like in your research, I think starting with Mac Brazel, who was the rancher with the craft supposedly crashed on, from the earlier accounts, it said that the wreckage was, I forgot the actual distance, but it covered such a vast amount of the ground that his sheep that he usually would bring out to pasture wouldn't cross it. That automatically, if that's a true account, would automatically, there's no weather balloon that's of that size, that enormous, that would cause for like his livestock to take that position or for him to even be of interest. And then there again, this is something, weather balloons, everybody in Roswell was familiar with them. They knew how to identify them. The mogul explanation was supposedly just secret experimental weather balloon or whatever. But can you clarify that particular claim, like the massive wreckage associated with what was found on his ranch? Can you bring any light to that?
Yeah, the Air Force says, and they wrote a book on this. The Air Force released a book about what they think Roswell is, and it's the mogul weather balloon. Right. And they're like, we had dummies that we would drop as well.
Crash dummies.
Turned out, they looked into that, and the crash dummies weren't dropped until I believe it was like 1954 or something like that.
Yeah, right after the whole.
Right, and this wreckage on Mac Brazel's ranch stretched at least a quarter mile, which is far longer than a weather balloon.
Certainly.
And it was wider. There was a gouge in the ground where this object had dug into the earth, which our weather balloon can't do. The ranch next to the Mac Brazel had a huge landing trace of calcified ground where it was like something so hot had landed there that it actually turned the sand to glass. So what apparently happened was this craft was perhaps struck by lightning. There was a lightning storm. Perhaps it was interfered with by our radar array, which is another theory that's been going around. But at any rate, something happened. This craft made an emergency landing next to the Brazel Ranch, took off, got in bad distress, crash landed on the Brazel Ranch, made a gouge a quarter mile long, took off, hit the mountaintop on the other side, went down to the desert on the other side, and crashed there, where it was seen by a group of archaeological students. And that's where a bunch of other witnesses, Frank Dwyer, I believe, went to that incident, whereas others were being brought to the Brazel case. And so while that one's being covered up, Mac Brazel's going to his ranch. He's like, oh my God, what is this? My sheep won't cross it. And he gathers up a bunch of wreckage, takes it to the base, stops at his home, shows it to his son, who I talked to.
Oh, really?
More than
Okay.
once.
Right.
Yeah, I did one of the last interviews with the son, actually.
Wow. Gotcha. Yeah.
So he passed away, actually.
I didn't know that. Okay.
So a lot of witnesses, and he takes it to the base, and so at the same time the actual crash retrieval location is being covered up. There's another incident that's breaking out and is separate. It's a very complicated case.
It is.
And at that same time, there's another crash apparently. And if you look into the New Mexico crash retrieval phenomena at that time, there's multiple. There's about 20 amazing cases, and some have just one witness to them.
Interesting.
Things that are crashed along the highway late at night and just crazy stuff. So the Roswell case is just one of them, and there's no way in hell, if you'll excuse the term, that this was a balloon. You know, I get really angry, I'm sorry, when it comes to this subject, because I'm not going to take it anymore. It's been far too long. Tell us the truth. If you don't, you know, our government is losing the faith of the people. There is a UFO movement. There's a disclosure movement. And if they don't come clean, they will no longer be trusted. Our government has a terrible track record and of covering up events. And it's time to come clean. And we are seeing movement on this now with, you know, the Pentagon disclosure recently.
That's right. That's a big one indeed. That I thought it would never happen. I've had friends who've known me, like I'm sure of yourself, when as long as I could remember, it's been an insatiable thing that I've had with trying to, you know, you follow this, you chase it to a degree, and it's, you know, it's a passion you enjoy to an extent. But I know personally for me, friends who are like, oh, that's just, you know, some whatever. They don't really pay too much attention to it because it's like, what significance does it have pertaining to what I'm doing now, so to speak, right? But then I found it fascinating. Like I've had several people send me clips, or they've, like I'm sure you've experienced too. They said, hey, you know, you were saying this like years ago, and now that it's, you know, there is a inkling of disclosure. I mean, it is a bit gratifying, but you know, I think for us that are already, you know, immersed in it, you're like, oh, I kind of moved on. I already knew this, right? You're still waiting for it to really, you know, tear down the Berlin Wall, so to speak. I mean, that hasn't happened, but it's like, you know, we're miles down the road where others have. It's like I said, it's gratifying to an extent, but it's still not completely satisfying altogether, right? Because it's like, oh, we already know this, and you know, it's taking you 15, 20 years to catch up. But hey, you know, I guess every little victory counts. But
yeah, well, they show us a blurry picture of a UFO,
sure,
a pilot account. I'm like, well, hey, you know, I've seen better films than that.
Indeed.
And you know, there's still a cover up. It's still active.
Really.
And you know, it's definitely like James Forrestal. You brought him up.
Yeah.
You know, and President Kennedy was apparently assassinated over this subject because he was planning on going public. And I think this is the case with James Forrestal, who was a part of the original MJ-12, I believe.
Right.
And high-level guy who's, quote, committed suicide by jumping out of a hotel window. I don't think so. There's a lot of suspicious details associated with that particular incident.
Yeah.
And I mean, he was emotionally upset, but I think it was because he was trying to, you know, come clean with this subject. There's a lot of internal conflict, I think, with people who are covering this up because they know that this is so important, so groundbreaking that humanity deserves to know and will know. You can't keep the truth secret.
Sure.
Truth has a way of taking care of itself because it's true. You can't stop the truth. It's impossible because whatever is true is true.
Right.
And I think Forrestal knew that and was on the right side of history, and they shut him down.
And that's one of the, it seems like, in my personal opinion, from what I've researched, is almost like one of the first staggering cases of where you have, you know, the hammer come down on somebody. There was a film that Paul, I think Davies did, he did the Roswell, and it's probably on YouTube somewhere. And I recall seeing that. I think it aired on Showtime many moons ago. But there again, I implore anybody to look into James Forrestal, like surrounding his death, because actually I'm in the Washington D.C. area, so I think that one actually happened when he was taken to, I think, Bethesda Navy Hospital. And when you just look at, I mean, I think from any forensic scientist, if you analyze that case, there's no way that they're like what you said. He apparently jumped. I think they said he jumped out of the window, and then I think apparently changed his mind and said, "Oh, it's not a good idea," and then he falls to his death. But there are a couple of people that have done some, I think, some investigative type looking into what actually happened to him, and it's just, I mean, I think you can come to the conclusion like, oh, this guy was actually murdered. And in the film, I think memoirs and so forth that he had put together, there was some suggestion that he had a hard time digesting what it was, but at the same time, I think there was a concern that he was going to release what he felt that the world should know. And that's generally what we see too, like those who usually have or one of the first whistleblowers, and they're like, oh no, we can't have this. And there again, you get that again, you see that type of ubiquitous thing that happens to certain people who have their finger on the pulse, so to speak, and then something mysterious happens to them where they either, but have these circumstances where they either commit a strange suicide. It doesn't make any sense when you look at the forensic evidence, or something other. They just disappear altogether.
Right.
Unreal. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty upsetting to say the least.
It is. And I understand the frustration and the anger, because it's just like, wow, really? Because there again, depending on who's behind this, there are criminal acts, and there's certainly like, for however you want to look at it, there are murders being, caused by particular, information that's trying to be kept under wraps. And then, of course, if you look into it, it's overwhelming there again, like the evidence associated with it.
Yeah, if the government wants to cover this up, if there are things the public shouldn't know, that's fine. But tell us, and don't completely lie. Just say, we're dealing with the UFO phenomena. It's a very sensitive subject. And this is what we know, and this is what, this is as far as we're willing to take it. But to completely deny it when you know it's real is not fair. And causes all kinds of problems, because this is when conspiracies develop and people start having to develop their own belief system because you're not forthcoming.
That's right.
So if you're lying, well, then you have no excuse when people don't believe you.
That's right. Exactly. Right.
A ranch hand by the name of Mac Brazel lived and worked out here. On the morning of July 3rd, he found it. In a pattern perhaps 3/4 of a mile long and 250 feet wide was a scattering of pieces of things. They had fallen everywhere, landing on the wet sand and in sinkholes filled with rainwater. There were scraps of metal and other lightweight material like foil. There was fiber or string, and there were slender sticks suggesting structural beams. On these sticks, he saw markings that reminded him of symbols scratched in clay by Indians. Petroglyphs, they're called. That's how they looked to Mac Brazel. Others who would see them later compared them to Egyptian hieroglyphics.
Mac would remember that the debris was so deeply packed, the sheep refused to cross the field. He had to herd them around it. Water that was more than a mile away.
He gathered up some of the pieces and took them to the house of his nearest neighbors, Floyd and Loretta Proctor.
He described the stuff to us, and we advised him to, come to Roswell and report it. We'd heard that, there's a reward for UFOs, and we call them flying saucers.
The road was no better then than now, and because of that, it was after dark by the time they got there. Meantime, the sheriff's 2 deputies returned to Roswell with a story of their own. They had missed the debris field, they said, but instead found this, a circle in a pasture where the sand had been melted to glass.
Bigger than a football field, a huge area, a huge circle that had been burnt.
With calls still pouring in from as far away as London and Hong Kong, the Roswell Daily Record hit the street with a front-page banner headline. The newspaper based its story on Lieutenant Haught's press release. But, as we know now, more than 40 years later, the media was about to be sealed off from the facts and spoon-fed an alibi.
Army officers found Mac Brazel and put him under house arrest. Hours of intense grilling would follow, and he was subjected to a complete physical examination. Then, on July 9th, at radio station KGFL, Walt Whitmore got a special telephone call from Washington. He was ordered not to broadcast his recorded interview with Mac Brazel.
The suggestion was made to us that if we wanted to keep our license, we would not use the interview on the air, because that would give us about 24 hours to find something else to do beside the radio business.
Next, Army officers searched all the radio stations and newspapers in Roswell. They seized all copies of the press release and anything else they could find that pertained to the story. Then, on July 9th, Mac Brazel, escorted by officers, turned up at radio station KGFL with a brand new story, not at all like the one he told Walt Whitmore while in hiding.
Then in 1975, a woman suffering from cancer made a deathbed statement to a nurse at St. Petersburg Community Hospital in Florida.
When I was a nurse on a terminally ill floor, we had a patient who was admitted, and one day I went in to bathe this patient, and she was more alert than she usually was. She was very suspicious acting. She asked me if I could draw the curtain. She wanted to know if there was another patient in the other bed, and I said no, which I was a little surprised because she wasn't so alert. In fact, most things that she did was call out one particular name. So she proceeded to talk to me, and she said there's something that she needs to talk to someone about, that she needed to tell them something. She said, I've held it in a long time. And then she said that a lot of years ago she was out with a bunch of people, and they were, she said, rock hunting. And she kept saying, I wasn't supposed to be there, but I went. And she goes, and then she said, I wish I hadn't. And she said they were out and they were walking around, and they came upon a hill, and they went over the hill. And she said then they saw a large shiny object. And she said it was very large, and they wanted to see more, so they started walking toward it. She said that when they got there, that there was a large round object, and it was sitting on the ground. And she said, and then on the ground was some, she goes, blankets or something. And she said that one of the guys from the expedition, one of the men, walked over and they pulled back the covers. And she said there were little people. She couldn't believe it. There were actually little people. She said they had very large heads and very big eyes, and she said they had some kind of shiny material on. And I can't remember if she said what color. I thought she said blue, but I really can't remember at this point. But she said it was so shiny, it was almost like it was fluid-like. And she said, and then she became very upset, and she goes, but you mustn't tell anybody. She goes, never tell anybody. And at this point, she would just keep looking around the room. She was very paranoid acting, and she said, because they can always find you. And I said to her, I said, who can always find you? She goes, the government can always find you.
Carefully setting up an alibi, General Ramey ordered Colonel Blanchard, the 509's commander, to send his intelligence officer, Major Marcel, to Fort Worth. Marcel took to the general's office some of the debris packed in a small box. Leaving the box on his desk, the general then led the major into another room, suggesting they look at a map. When they returned, the box had disappeared. In its place was a damaged weather balloon. Next, General Ramey called in the reporters. Just a mistake, he announced. Major Marcel and the 509th Bomb Group had goofed. Besides, the general added, this one was a new kind of balloon. It was case closed by mid-afternoon. But we know now that some of the debris already had been delivered to the general earlier that day. If it were nothing but a weather balloon, why did he say so then and there, defuse the situation, and placate the Pentagon? Dr. Jesse Marcel was 11 years old when his father, Major Marcel, came home with a carload of curious objects one night. Dr. Marcel now lives in Helena, Montana. He remembers that his father woke him up about 2 o'clock in the morning, showing him and his mother the things he found.
The thing that set this apart from anything that I'd ever seen before or since was the marking zone parts of the wreckage. In the I-beam structural members, there was like a writing of sorts. I remember at the time thinking this was like hieroglyphic, but it wasn't really hieroglyphic, but it was more of geometrical forms and symbols along the inner surface of an I-beam. And They were kind of a metallic purple hue and seemed like they were embossed in the metal itself. And I suppose that is the singular thing that sets us apart from more ordinary debris. I do know it was not a weather balloon or radar target as was proposed by the Air Force. Because I was, even at that young age, I was familiar with things like what a radar target should look like, what a weather balloon certainly would look like. And since they used that as a cover story for this extraordinary debris, I knew that there must be something very unusual about that. And so I have come around to the realization that this was out of this world.
In May of 1990, Dr. Marcel agreed to be placed under hypnosis. It was an effort by Don Schmidt and his colleagues to retrieve from the doctor's mind lost memories, to see again clearly the indecipherable symbols on those sticks of debris, the ones that looked like structural beams.
Circle in Bozeman Square.
A circle there?
Circle Bozeman
Square. Yes. Is the square inside the circle or outside the circle? Inside.
Frankie Rowe tried not to remember. She says threats to separate her from her family and send her to prison pushed memories of the incident deep into a shadowy corner of her mind. But years later, as parts of the story became public, Mrs. Rowe's memories came rushing back. The memories and the anger. Now she believes the American public has a right to know everything, the whole story, even small pieces of it, like the pieces of metal she saw and touched.
And he pulled his hand out of his pocket, and he had a piece of the material wadded up in his hand in a little tiny ball, and when he dropped it on the table, it spread out like it was liquid or quicksilver, and there was not one wrinkle in that. And I do remember that we all did get to touch it. We all got to pick it up. You could bend it, it made no crinkle, no noise. It was very thin and it was very shiny, very silvery color. It was about maybe a foot square. And I have no idea what happened to it.
More than 40 years have passed since the crash. The government still sticks to the official explanation. The military is still stonewalling. However, in later years, a few cracks have begun to appear in that wall. Major Marcel would talk again to his son, telling him no, it definitely was not a weather balloon. But let's start with the story of Brownie. Melvin E. Brown was a sergeant with the 509th in New Mexico at the time of the crash. Later, he was transferred to England. He married an English woman, and following retirement, settled down with his family in a suburb near London. Over the years, on several occasions, he would tell his daughters bits and pieces of a curious story. But on his deathbed in 1982, Brownie gave up the rest of the secret.
It's almost as if when he'd actually told the story, he wished he hadn't. All available men were grabbed. That's his actual words I'm saying here now that I can remember. All available men were grabbed. They all had to go out to the desert where a crashed saucer had come down. And they all had to stand guard duty around this site. They were told to look, but not look, not to take anything in. And him and this other guy did look, and they lifted up the covers. And he did say that these trucks were coveralls. I don't know what he meant by that. It must have been some sort of truck with a cover. He lifted up, him and this other guy both lifted up the cover and saw, I say 2 bodies, but my sister remembers him as saying 3. We disagree on that. They saw these bodies, and they were about 4 foot tall, no more than that, maybe even less. Much larger heads than we have, slanted eyes, yellowish skin.
Far from London, in Lincoln County, New Mexico, we searched for an elusive witness with an even stranger story. We found him living elsewhere and have promised not to disclose his whereabouts. His name is Glenn Dennis. In 1947, Mr. Dennis was a mortician, the manager of Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell, New Mexico.
Here in Roswell, on the afternoon of July 8th, a local mortuary began getting calls from the hospital at the airbase. There were questions about the preservation of tissue and what specific chemicals would do to the tissue. and Clardy's Dairy and Creamery in Roswell received an order for a large quantity of dry ice. After 4 or 5 calls to the mortuary, the mortician decided there must have been a fatal crash at the airbase. That was the beginning of the most remarkable story connected with the Roswell crash. This is the gentleman to whom we have referred, the mortician, Glenn Dennis. In 1947, he was manager of Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell. Those telephone calls from the base hospital on July 8th started a chain of events leading to threats against his own life and the reported death of a close friend. Let's go back now to the afternoon of July 8th.
Then the next call I got, probably in 30, 45 minutes later, he was asking me then about our preparations and what we did preparing the bodies that had been laying out in the elements, or that, you know, some badly decomposed bodies, or how we treated the burnt bodies, otherwise very traumatic cases, and what our procedure was on that. Then the next question was, well, what would you do where you wouldn't change any of the chemical contents, you wouldn't destroy any of the blood, you wouldn't destroy anything that might be very important later on, you know, down the road? What would your process and what you do and with the chemicals that you use, would that change the blood contents and everything? I knew at the time that there was something that probably happened. I thought maybe it was something that they weren't ready to release, or there might be some VIP or something they didn't want. But I mean, I had no idea what it was. But I told him at the time, I said, you know, I can come out and I can help you if you have that. And he said, no, this is for future, in case this should happen in the future. He said, this is something we need to know so we'll know how to proceed.
Questions about chemicals, tissue, and the preservation of blood, as well as other body fluids. Very strange questions. If doctors at the base were examining the remains at the time of those telephone calls, it follows that by July 8th, the bodies had been removed from the second crash site to the base hospital. That would match key points in the story told by Sergeant Brown.
Not only that, but Glenn Dennis' story tends to corroborate the story told by witness Frankie Rowe.
Now, he felt that the one that was alive, he said later that it was taken out to the base hospital. And a friend of ours, her husband was working out there at the time, and he saw the one person walk in.
Later that same afternoon, Glenn Dennis drove an injured airman to the base hospital following a minor automobile accident. Walking into the emergency room, Dennis saw debris in the back of a parked Army ambulance.
What I noticed that was so unusual about this, that there was some inscriptions or a border around this part of it. It was probably 3 inches, maybe around 3 inches, but it was kind of going along the contour of the wreckage. And at the time, after I got back, I got to thinking about this and what the border looked like, and it kind of reminded me, reminded me of an Egyptian inscriptions of figures and whatever.
Now another piece in our jigsaw puzzle drops into place. It appears doctors were continuing their examinations of the bodies as Mr. Dennis entered the emergency room. Assisting them was a nurse, whom he describes as a close friend.
One of the nurses, lieutenant nurses that I was acquainted with very well, she was very excited, and she said, how did you get in here? What are you doing here? And get out immediately, or you're going to get in a lot of trouble. She said, get out of here as fast as you can.
The nurse disappeared into another room, presumably where the examination was still in progress. But serious trouble was in store for Glenn Dennis, the result of a chance remark to an officer who stopped him as he was leaving.
But I said, it looks like you've had a crash. I said, I see some debris in the ambulances there. And that's probably where I really got in trouble right there. And he said, well, just a moment. And then he went to the door and he motioned for somebody, and about that time there was 2 MPs that came out. And he said, get this man out here, get him out here as fast as you can get him out of here. And then we were starting down the hall, and then there was a man that we heard a voice said, "I'm not through with that SOB yet," said, "Bring him back."
Mr. Dennis says suddenly he was rushed into a room where he was confronted by two men he had never seen before, an Army sergeant and a captain with red hair. A sharp exchange followed, in which Dennis says both men threatened to kill him.
The captain told me, the red-headed captain told me, he said, "There was no crash here, you did not see anything," and he said, "You don't go into town, you don't tell anybody anything that you saw anything else." He said, "If you do, you will get in real serious trouble." Well, I was a little agitated because I didn't like the name he called me to start with. And I informed him, I said, "Look, I'm a civilian, you can't do a damn thing to me, and you, as far as I'm concerned, you can go to hell." And that was the exact words that I told him, and I remember it very clearly. And then the black sergeant, he said, "Oh, don't kid yourself, young man." He said, "Somebody be picking your bones out of the sand."
What on the earth could he have done that he would have been so worried about on his deathbed? Because he was worried about it. I mean, he was mentioning this place in his sleep and sort of shaking his head and nodding and arguing in his sleep about it and mentioning it. He was worried about it. Whatever it was, he was really worried. And this is what makes me angry. It makes me rather bitter to think that, all right, I don't know, UFOs, alien bodies, I don't know what the truth is. All I know is that if my dad said so, then that's it. He wouldn't have lied.
This man claims to have spoken with a doctor who dissected the alien bodies.
The medical person he had reference to had information about the anatomy of the alien, the dead alien that was taken from a crashed disc.
He is Leonard Stringfield, the retired marketing director of a large chemical company. Stringfield has devoted more than 20 years to investigating and writing about UFO phenomena. He specializes in suspected crashes and retrievals.
The head is large, very large by human proportion. There is no hair follicles. There are no earlobes. There is no nose as we have as human. The mouth is just a slit or an orifice which goes in about approximately an inch, membranous, which leads to no digestive tract or alimentary system. There were no red cells, no lymphocytes. There were no striatum muscles in the body. There was an atria, or a heart, the pumping station, so to speak, for the colorless liquid, which is, in a sense, blood.
After the Roswell crash, dozens of soldiers and others connected with the military were pressured never, under any circumstances, ever to speak of the incident again. Accounts surfacing only now, more than 40 years later, indicate the tactics used to enforce secrecy were ruthless. Which brings us back to the witness we mentioned just a few moments ago, the friend of the mortician, the Army nurse.
And this was a young second lieutenant, had only been in the service less than 3 months and commissioned less than 3 months. A very deeply religious lady. She was born and raised in a very strict Catholic family, attended all the private Catholic schools, preschool and high schools, and her folks wanted her to become a nun, but she...
At Mr. Dennis' request, we've agreed not to use her real name, but we will call the nurse Judy. Sensitive and deeply religious. What she saw in the examining room July 8th, 1947, took Judy to the brink of hysteria.
And she said, "I can't believe what I've just seen." She said, "This was the most horrible thing I've ever seen in my life." She was going into this examination room that was across the hall. She was going in to get some supplies, and when she walked in the door, there was 2 doctors there. And she noticed a horrible smell immediately. But she saw these 2 doctors, and they said, "We need you." She started out the door and said, "You stay here, we've got to have you." And what it was, they were examining, she told me, 3 bodies, foreign bodies. And she said 2 of them were very mutilated.
According to Mr. Dennis, Judy and both doctors became ill from the stench of the bodies as they continued to examine them. Judy was still not well the following day when Glenn met her for lunch at the officers' club. But he was more disturbed by her emotional state.
I knew she was almost in a state of shock because she said it was so gruesome and so horrible, you know, and she would just, you know, almost grab her head, and it looked like she was just going into total shock.
We should note here that Glenn's concern for Judy was serious. Marriage had been discussed, but all of that was about to change forever. He never dreamed what lay in store for Judy as she began to describe what she had seen.
She had drawn me just a little the night before. She had a description of an arm that was that she had drawn, and then the anatomy of the arm, which was different from ours. There was only 4 fingers on the hand. Didn't have a thumb to it. Only 4 very slim, fragile little fingers. But when they turned one of the hands over, they noticed at the end of the fingers there was little pads on each one of the 4 fingers there. And it looked to them like they were like little suction cups. They were little hollowed out areas that looked kind of like a suction cup. The heads on these individuals were much larger, somewhat larger than the human head would be. The eyes were very sunken. The nose was there wasn't a convex or anything. The nose was very concave with only 2 little orifices. The ears, there was no ear. There only might be 2 little orifices on the side, but very small little lobes that looked like they might function, might close maybe or whatever, but they was very small. Nothing resembled an ear on a human anatomy at all.
Not touching their food, they continued to talk. But for Judy and Glenn, time was running out.
She never touched her food at all, we never, you know, I think I drank my Coke, but I was so, you know, I thought, my God, this was something else, and I don't know that I ever ate my food either, but that was then. She said, I've got to go back to the barracks. He said, I am deathly ill, and I've got to go back to the barracks, and then that was the last time I ever saw her.
We have been told not only soldiers, but civilian firemen worked at the crash sites. Apparently, some got the carrot, some got the stick, including Frankie Rowe's father, who remained silent, but angry for the rest of his life.
And he was very angry for a long time about that the government could do this, that they could just totally suppress something that actually happened. And he knew that it happened. He had seen them.
Confidential military sources told our researchers that more than a dozen military policemen who guarded the crash site were paid $10,000 apiece, a very large carrot in 1947.
The letter that I had sent to her with the APO number was returned to me, and on the envelope it said, return to sender, and then it had a big red print said deceased.
By the end of July, the turbulence caused by the Roswell crash had settled. Most of the media bought the official explanation, and most of the public had forgotten the incident. It was nothing but a weather balloon. Or was it? If you don't think this looks like a flying saucer, would you believe a meteorite? Apparently the government did, because next they sent an expert on meteorites to investigate. They sent him to this area, about 5 miles from the debris field, to look at that circle in the pasture where the sand had been melted to glass. Dr. Lincoln LaPaz of the University of New Mexico was a noted authority on meteorites and their recovery. He had worked on dozens of top-secret assignments, including the Manhattan Project. About 2 months after the crash, Dr. Lincoln LaPaz was asked to calculate the speed and trajectory of whatever it was that came down out here. LaPaz had not been told about the alleged recovery of bodies. After investigating, he concluded not a meteorite, but an aircraft had struck the ground. Given the heat and the speed, the doctor couldn't believe it came from Earth. He was convinced it must have been an unoccupied probe from another planet. The key word is convinced. 1 year later, Dr. LaPaz had not changed his mind. This from former counterintelligence agent Louis Rickett, who remembered a conversation with LaPaz in September of 1948.
If all the government recovered was a weather balloon, why was it still investigating the crash 2 months later? Except for being torn, the weather balloon displayed by the general was virtually intact. Yet pieces of something were scattered 3/4 of a mile across the desert. Pieces of what? How could a veteran combat officer like Major Jesse Marcel fail to recognize a weather balloon?
On his return from Fort Worth, Marcel went to the intelligence office. There he ran into the counterintelligence officer who had prepared a report about the activities that had taken place at Roswell. Marcel asked to see a copy of the report and was told, no, you can't, it's classified. Marcel said, I outrank you, I want to see the report. And the counterintelligence officer responded, if you have a problem, take it up with Washington.
And last but not least, why use threats, bribes, and loyalty oaths to keep secret a weather balloon already displayed to newspaper photographers?
There's an adage worth repeating here. They say, if it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. We can't say for sure, but what happened in Roswell certainly looks and sounds like a cover-up.
If there is a hidden answer to this riddle, then the secret may not have been kept without a price. There is the matter of 3 lives and the curious circumstances under which those lives were lost.
Now we return to Glenn Dennis and the story of his friend Judy, the Army nurse. Remember, it was Judy who told Glenn she assisted 2 doctors examining bodies of humanoid creatures brought to the base hospital. According to Mr. Dennis, she described the bodies in detail and even drew sketches. After lunch with Glenn, Judy left the officers' club and vanished.
The next day, I called out. I wanted to see how she was doing and how she was feeling. And, of course, you know, by that time I was really fascinated by what was going on, and I was so curious I wanted, you know, maybe she'd feel like talking a little more about it. But I was really concerned on what was happening to her. And they told me that she wasn't working, that she was unavailable that day. And so the next day I made the call again. I made 2 or 3 calls the next day. And it was also, she was still unavailable. And then the 3rd day I called and they said that she'd been transferred out. And they didn't know where, but she was no longer there at the air base.
Transferred without a word, no goodbyes, and no explanations. Judy was a 2nd lieutenant with less than 4 months at Roswell, her first duty assignment. For days, Glenn kept asking questions, but got no answers.
Well, then about maybe 10 days to 2 weeks or so later, I get a letter from her in the mail addressed to the funeral home. And all it was just inside with just a note said, I can't write, I don't have time to write now, but here's an APO number that you can send me the mail to. And that was all that was in the envelope. There wasn't anything else.
APO numbers are used by the military to forward mail to American servicemen and women without disclosing their locations. But through friends at the base, Glenn quickly learned the APO number sent by Judy meant that her letter originated in England. He replied immediately, then waited.
Probably 2 weeks, or maybe it was at least 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks later, the letter that I had sent to her with the APO number was returned to me, and on the envelope it said, return to sender, and then it had a big red print said deceased. And that was the last time I heard or, you know, even thought about it. And then about every time I'd go to the base, too, sometimes we wouldn't go there for a week or 2 on emergencies or whatever, but 2 or 3 weeks or so later, I would go out to base and I said, has anyone heard from the lieutenant? And one of the nurses says, well, the rumor is that she is in England. Well, in her note, she also told me, she said, I am in London. And then the nurses told me that she was in London. The rumor is that she was on maneuvers on a training mission with 5 other nurses, and they went down on a plane. And they understand the rumor was that they were all killed in a plane crash.
Later on, another key person in the Roswell mystery was reported killed in a plane crash. He was Lieutenant Colonel Payne Jennings, executive officer of the 509th Bomb Group. And finally, there was the curious accident which claimed the life of a soldier believed to have worked at one of the crash sites.
We have information concerning a heavy equipment operator, for example, that was found crushed to death by his own vehicle. with his unscathed glasses found 100 feet from the site.
The Roswell crash. Even after years of research, 100 questions still come to mind, most without answers. It's not our purpose to prove or disprove this story, only to present those facts and witnesses we could find and let you decide. We applaud the courage of those who come forward in this documentary to speak for the record. We believe, as they do, that the time is now to unlock the truth, and that the United States government holds the key.
It is frightening now when I think about it. I can't believe that I could have forgotten as much as I did because of the threats.
I mean, it's crazy. But yeah, I'm bitter. I'm angry. I don't give monkeys about the bodies and I mean, what I want to find out is why. All right, they must have had a good reason, obviously, for doing it. But I don't know. I can't see that it is that important anymore, that it has to be covered up.
You know, I think it's time they wash their linen and at least give the people an explanation of why we shouldn't talk about it in the first place if it was a national security item, or, I mean, you know, just the reason why everyone should keep this and why they should keep covering it up. I think they owe the American people an explanation why this happened, I mean, why they're not doing this. And let us know, and then the people know to either keep their mouth shut or go on their way.
After almost 50 years, there is still no change in the official story. But whether a spaceship did or did not crash in New Mexico, one thing is perfectly clear. Details of the incident have been wrapped for decades in layer upon layer of secrecy, which raises the most tantalizing question of all. Why? Would proof of intelligent life on another planet destroy this civilization, wreck the edifice of science, and undermine religion? Is that what they fear? Centuries ago, those same fears motivated enemies of Copernicus and Galileo, who revealed a simple truth every schoolboy knows today, that the sun is the center of our solar system, and Earth revolves around it. Or is there something more? Could the visitors, if there are visitors, be predators, indifferent to human life or human suffering? Have our leaders been shielding us from a terrible truth? Even so, what has all the secret-keeping bought us?